I'm here with Antonio Garcia. Professor Garcia teaches for the Delta College program. He's been at Brockport. This is his second year as a faculty member here at the college. Antonio, first off, and actually I didn't give you this question in advance. I'm almost embarrassed to ask this question, but I can never seem to get a straight answer. Is it Freire? Is it Freire? I mean, how do you pronounce Paulo Freire's name?
It's Freire.
Freire, okay.
The more Spanish inclined you are, I guess the more you're gonna kind of want to pronounce it out. But even if you mistaken say Freire, and people, what's important is more the concept and the name dropping, and people understand once you get past that.
And that's the approach I typically take, but I figured I'd ask. So my first question is how does Freire's critique of the banking model of education extend similar earlier critiques made by Dewey and others? And I guess I should say that my students in this class haven't had to read Dewey, but they've read bell hooks. They've read a little bit of Michael Apple's work, An Introduction to a Book on Democratic Education. So they're similar with, they're familiar with others who are influenced by Dewey, but maybe you could just talk a little bit how Freire was sort of influenced by and extended Dewey.
One of the things to look at is that the banking method is actually not an original concept with, if you through philosophical text, even with, for example, Arthur Schopenhauer or Michel de Montaigne, Montaigne even says at one point, we basically just toss facts in kids' heads, but what do they really do with them? So this idea that it's a one-way street of authoritarian knower down to this empty vessel becomes problematic. And so, as we know that's in the bourgeois landscape of these very privileged kids, and of course, back in that day, their whole goal was basically to know the arts, the classics, to be trained for bourgeois lifestyle. With Paulo Freire, it's switched a little bit in the idea that this kind of top-down, let me tell you what information you need to know, becomes kind of an oppressive feature, especially when we're looking at students. And it really relegates them to a particular type of knowledge. And that's why, in education, we see a lot of studies where we're really looking at the issue of epistemology. How does knowledge come into effect? When looking at Dewey basically had problems with not necessarily the facts that were going in per se, but the fact that we were training students for a world that may or may not exist for them. So when you look at Dewey, he's very much, it needs to be connected to the home life. Mm-hmm. And we could even actually look for, at this point, people talk about culture relevant teaching, which would kind of come out of that. If you have urban students, or even if you have rural students, why isn't the curriculum connected to that kind of rural landscape and life? So Dewey kind of basically gives us a foundation for this progressive ideal of education being something more and really challenging those epistemological foundations. And that's what we see in philosophy, which is that the argument of where does knowledge come from, and then also the spin-off of that, which is belief. So you can see, in today's time, we have a lot of myths that are created by this kind of what do we really know and versus what do we believe. And of course, within the idea of a democratic landscape in politics today, those two are kind of obfuscated, especially by political pundits and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I guess just to maybe see if I understood you correctly, the idea is that Dewey and then Freire, following him, kind of challenged this notion of, as you said, knowledge versus belief, and this assumption that the sort of positivist assumption that that the two are not related in any way, and they they basically make the claim that all knowledge is somehow kind of it's at least understood through a culture, through filters, through authorities. And the traditional view of knowledge was always that you should accept whatever authority has to tell you in terms of your educational authorities. And so Dewey, and then followed by Freire, kind of turn that notion on its head and say that, in fact, if you really want to learn in a liberatory way, to put it in Freire's terms, you need to sort of question that assumption that all knowledge comes from recognized authority.
Yeah.
Okay, good. My second question then is, what exactly is critical pedagogy, and why is Freire considered the founder of critical pedagogy? And is he? I'd probably assume that.
I mean, kind of going with the history of what we would claim to be critical pedagogy, we would point towards Freire as kind of providing that landscape. Obviously, with the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that's where a lot of people point to kind of this is where it starts. Mm-hmm. But what really prompted Freire and actually brought him into the kind of U.S. educational landscape was Peter McLaren and Henry Giroux.
Oh, okay.
And those two, who your students may or may not know, are basically the two key names when we hear about critical pedagogy, critical anything. And also you're looking at critical pedagogy comes about at a time that's, in the 70s, you have kind of a body of young scholars who have come out of the civil rights movement. They've seen Vietnam. They've seen a world basically on its path to its own destruction in this very kind of Herbert Marcusean way. For as much as we progress, we're progressing towards our own destruction at the same time. So shortly after that, late 70s rolls into the 80s, we had the cultural backlash with Reaganization, and then of course too, the term that's thrown around a lot now is neoliberalization. So this kind of free market, kind of Ayn Randian influence, and so forth. Where critical pedagogy came in was really identifying with kind of this need for struggle, that it really was steeped in this kind of class division, and a lot of it was founded on kind of a Marxist idealism and philosophy that, there is class struggle, there is a division. The concept of alienation and what it means to be alienated from one's work really comes into play. And then the democratic feature was also very important, because for a lot of these scholars who really, we could say, are like the kind of the founders, like Michael Apple, for critical pedagogy, the idea of democracy, and I would say it's still questionable for many of them, but they were looking at, okay, so who can vote, who can't vote? So for example, we talk about black people and civil rights. We're not looking at slavery 200 years ago. We're really looking at about 50 years ago in the grand scope of things, where a lot starts really moving in basically the mid 1900s. So it's interesting is how it's set up, and that what causes these divisions, and then the idea of oppression really comes in. Now, I will say that with critical pedagogy, it's not a monolithic thing. So, for example, the way Peter McLaren kind of frames critical pedagogy is very deeply rooted in Marxism and this Marxist project. The work that Chris Holland and I do is actually more towards this idea of a multitude, more kind of a Deleuzian Marxism, or what some people may refer to as like a neo-Marxism. So kind of bringing Marx into today's time and trying to see what's really possible. And I think that's one of the critiques of critical pedagogy that you have to look at in anyone's work is, not just the possible and the practical, but also the palatable. And the palatable, I think, is one of the most important points, because when you're talking to pre-service teachers and, you say, let's read something that's grounded in Marxism, many of them have this automatic kind of, oh, wait, Marx is bad. But there's a lot to be said within Marxism that, we can take, but then also kind of like Freud. There's a lot that he gave, but also some things that we realize he missed the mark on. And I think you have to do the same with Marxism. And you can read Marx without being a Marxist. And I think that's also a point that many teachers, kind of think that if I read this, I'm going to become this.
Radical is a dirty word.